Somewhere in the high desert of southern Jordan, carved directly into walls of rose-red sandstone, there is a city that has stood mostly empty for 1,000 years. Tomb facades 4 stories tall, engineered water channels still threading the canyons, temples cut into living rock with a precision modern stonemasons still find difficult to replicate. The textbooks will tell you a civilization vanished here. A wealthy Arabian trading people who controlled the incense roads of the ancient world defied Greek and Roman armies for 3 centuries, and then somewhere in the late antique period simply faded from history. For more than 1,000 years, that was the story. Then ancient DNA was extracted from the bones beneath the city, and when the results came back, almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The Nabataeans were never who classical sources told us they were, and more unsettling than that, they never actually left. To understand what the DNA overturned, you have to first understand what the DNA was overturning, and that means going back to a kingdom that for nearly 4 centuries was the wealthiest thing happening between the Mediterranean and the Arabian interior. Petra sits in a narrow valley of southern Jordan, ringed by sandstone cliffs and accessible only through a slot canyon barely wide enough for 2 camels to pass. There is no river of any consequence, no fertile valley, no obvious reason, looking at it today, why anyone would build anything there at all. And yet, between roughly the 3rd century BC and the 2nd century AD, it became the political, religious, and architectural center of a kingdom that controlled the flow of frankincense, myrrh, and bitumen across half the ancient world. The Nabataeans walked onto the stage of recorded history in 312 BC, and they walked on already lethal. The Macedonian general Antigonus, the One-Eyed, sent his commander Athenaeus to plunder Petra and seize the bitumen industry. Athenaeus took the city, looted what he could, captured women and children as slaves, and made camp for the night before marching to Syria. Under the moonlight, 8,000 camel-riding Nabataeans warriors descended on the camp and massacred the Greeks. The Antagonids tried twice more. Both expeditions failed. The Nabataeans were not a tribal society in the usual sense. They were already organized, already capable, already untouchable. The wealth came from monopoly. Bitumen for Egyptian mummification, frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia. Spices funneled north through caravan routes that no one else could navigate. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus described them as far surpassing the other Arab tribes in wealth, though numbering scarcely 10,000 strong. They built Petra to advertise that wealth. Tomb facades carved directly into the cliffs, 4 and 5 stories tall. Markets and bazaars, astronomical alignments built into temple thresholds, tracking solstices and equinoxes across decades-long cycles. Engineered cisterns and pressurized water channels that brought cold pools and lush gardens into a desert that should never have supported them, and they could not be conquered. The Seleucids did not break them. The Hasmoneans of Judea fought them for a century without taking the kingdom. When Pompey's Romans arrived at Petra in 62 BC, they besieged the city, surveyed the harsh canyon terrain, and accepted a bribe of 500 talents to withdraw. The Nabataeans were the only people in the region powerful enough to make Rome simply walk away. By every measurable standard, Nabataea was extraordinary. The engineering, the trade reach, the diplomatic survival, the scale of monumental construction and terrain that should have made it impossible. This was not a scattering of desert tribes. This was a coordinated state with hereditary kings, foreign embassies, and a capital city that still leaves modern hydrologists puzzled by how it actually worked. And then, somewhere in the late antique period, it ended. The end did not arrive in a single blow. It arrived in layers. In 106 AD, the Roman Emperor Trajan marched into Nabataea and annexed the kingdom as the province of Arabia Petraea. There was almost no fighting. The last Nabataean king, Rabel II, had died that year, and the kingdom passed into Roman administration with the quiet efficiency of a transaction long anticipated. The Nabataeans had been allied to Rome since the Battle of Actium more than a century earlier. The annexation was, in every meaningful sense, peaceful. The kingdom simply stopped being a kingdom. Then the economy turned. When Rome took Egypt, new naval routes opened across the Red Sea, and ships began carrying spices and incense directly from southern Arabia and India to Alexandria, bypassing the overland caravans entirely. The monopoly that had made the Nabataeans wealthy for 4 centuries dissolved within a few generations. Roman forts went up across the former kingdom, Roman roads cut across the old caravan routes. Greek and Latin inscriptions began outnumbering Aramaic ones in the cities the Nabataeans had built. The cultural fade followed. By the 3rd century AD, Christianity was sweeping through the eastern Roman provinces, and the temples of Dushara and Al-Uzza were rededicated as churches or simply abandoned. Greek replaced Aramaic as the language of public life. The Ghassanids, an Arab group migrating from the south, took over much of the region as Roman foederati, and the political landscape was reorganized around their leadership rather than around Petra. The name itself disappeared. By the 4th century, the word Nabataean stopped appearing in the historical record as a description of a living people. It became an archaism, a literary reference to a kingdom that had once existed. Petra continued to function as a regional center as late as the 6th century, but in steadily diminished form. A series of earthquakes damaged the city, including a catastrophic one in 363 AD that destroyed much of the urban core. The Islamic conquests of the 7th century absorbed what was left into the Umayyad Caliphate, and the trade routes shifted again, this time toward the new cities of the Hijaz and the rising centers of Damascus and Baghdad. By the medieval period, Petra was a ruin. Bedouin families lived in the carved tombs and grazed their flocks in the valleys, but the city as a city was gone. European travelers rediscovered it in 1812 and treated it as something out of legend, a lost civilization carved into the rock by a vanished people. That was the story for a very long time. It was the story in museums and travel guides. It was the story repeated in scholarly textbooks across 2 centuries. It was the story that made Petra one of the great lost civilization sites of the ancient world, alongside Angkor Wat and Machu Picchu. And almost all of it was constructed before anyone could read the bones. Ancient DNA analysis is exactly what it sounds like. Scientists extract genetic material from skeletal remains that have been in the ground for hundreds or thousands of years, sequence it against modern genomes, and build a detailed biological portrait of who those people were, where they came from, and how they are related to the populations still living today. It is, in every meaningful sense, a time machine made of bone. For most of the 20th century, this was not possible. The technology did not exist. Nabataean studies were conducted with the tools available, which meant inscriptions, pottery typologies, architectural analysis, and the surviving accounts of Greek, Roman, and Hebrew authors who had written about the Nabataeans from the outside. Those authors had their own categories and their own biases. They described the Nabataeans variously as Arabs, as a separate ethnic group, as a confederation of tribes, as desert nomads, as urban traders. The portrait that emerged was colorful, contradictory, and almost entirely shaped by people who were not Nabataean. The bones themselves sat unread. Skeletal remains from Petra, from the surrounding tombs of the Hisma and the Wadi Musa, from burial sites across the former kingdom were excavated, cataloged, and stored in museum drawers across Jordan, Israel, and Europe. The biological record of who these people had actually been was simply not part of the conversation. Then, in the last 15 years, ancient DNA studies of populations across the southern Levant and northern Arabia began to mature. Researchers extracted genetic material from burials in and around Petra and from comparable sites across the former Nabataean territory. They sequenced it. They compared it against the existing reference panels for ancient and modern populations of the Near East, and the picture that emerged did not match the textbook. The first finding was that the Nabataean genetic signature was overwhelmingly local. The bones beneath Petra did not show the population replacement that the historical narrative had implied. They showed deep continuity with earlier Iron Age and Bronze Age populations of the southern Levant, the same broad ancestral pool that had also fed into the Edomites, the early Arabs of the Behistun inscription, and the other Semitic groups Herodotus had described. The long-assumed migration from southern Arabia, repeated for generations in scholarly summaries, found little clear genetic backing. Whatever movements had occurred, they had not reshaped the population. The second finding mattered more. When researchers compared the ancient Nabataean genetic profile to the modern populations living in Jordan, the southern Levant, and the Sinai today, the signal did not weaken or fragment the way it should have. If the Nabataeans had truly vanished, it persisted. It was still there. The same ancestry, the same regional roots, the same biological lineage, present in living people whose families had farmed and herded the same valleys for 50 generations. The textbook had described a vanished people. The DNA described a population that had never gone anywhere. The classical sources had created the confusion. Greek and Roman writers described the Nabataeans through their own categories, sometimes as Arabs, sometimes as a separate ethnic group, sometimes as a desert confederation of uncertain origin. Hebrew sources added another layer of distance. The result was a portrait of foreignness, a people apart, mysterious migrants who had arrived from somewhere in the south and built a kingdom no one quite understood. The genetic evidence cuts through this. The Nabataeans were a regional people of the southern Levant and northern Arabia. Their roots ran deep into the Iron Age populations Herodotus had already described, the Arab tribes worshipping Alat and Al-Uzza, the subjects of Darius the Great mentioned in the Behistun inscription, the desert peoples who had been moving between the Hijaz and the Levantine coast for 1,000 years before Petra rose. They were not transplants. They were the ground itself. What had made them seem foreign in the surviving sources was not biology. It was culture. The Nabataeans were extraordinary cultural absorbers. Their pantheon mixed indigenous Arabian deities like Dushara and Al-Uzza and Alat with imported gods from every empire they traded with. Helios, Dionysus, Zeus, Isis, Atar, Gatis, all of them entered the Nabataean religious vocabulary and were worshipped in temples that sat alongside the sanctuaries of the older Arabian gods. Their clay lamps depicted scenes from Greek mythology beneath solar halos that came from older Mesopotamian iconography. Their architecture borrowed Hellenistic columns, Egyptian cornices, and Mesopotamian step patterns and layered them onto sandstone cliffs in a style that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. Their writing was Aramaic, the regional lingua franca of the entire Near East, which meant their inscriptions read as if they belonged to the broader Aramean cultural sphere. But the language they spoke among themselves was something else. It was an early form of Arabic, preserved in personal names, in occasional grammatical slips in the inscriptions, in the vocabulary that surfaces when scribes wrote about objects and rituals that had no Aramaic equivalent. The cosmopolitan surface and the indigenous core were running in parallel the entire time. Women in Nabataean society held more public power than in much of the Mediterranean world. They served as priestesses. They appeared on coins as queens. They were named alongside kings in royal inscriptions. Queen Shakilat ruled jointly with her husband Aretas IV and continued to appear on coinage during the reign of her son. This was not a borrowed Hellenistic feature. It was indigenous, and it persisted across the entire span of the kingdom. The pattern across all of this is consistent. The Nabataeans were not transplants from somewhere else. They were a regional Arab population that had built a sophisticated trading state and chosen, deliberately, to dress that state in the cultural fashions of every wealthier neighbor. The cosmopolitan surface was a strategy. What outsiders had read as foreignness was actually fluency. The standard story had the Nabataeans absorbed in stages. First by Rome, when Trajan dissolved the kingdom in 106 AD. then by the Ghassanids, the Arab confederation that moved into the region as Roman foederati in the 3rd and 4th centuries, then by the Byzantine Christian population that filled the cities of the eastern provinces, then finally by the Islamic Caliphate after the 7th century conquests. Layer by layer, the Nabataeans were said to have been replaced. Each successive wave was treated as a population turnover, a new people arriving and pushing the old ones aside. The genetic evidence tells a different story. The DNA extracted from late antique and early medieval burials across the former Nabataean homeland shows continuity, not replacement. The arrival of the Ghassanids did not introduce a major new genetic signal in the region. The Christianization of the 3rd and 4th centuries did not coincide with any detectable population movement. The Islamic conquest of the 7th century, which transformed the political and religious map of the entire Near East, did not produce the kind of biological turnover that the historical sources had implied. The same families kept living in the same valleys across all of these transitions. What changed was not the people. What changed was the labels. Nabataean was a political and economic identity. It was tied to a specific kingdom, a specific monopoly over the incense trade, a specific ruling dynasty that had carved its capital into the cliffs of southern Jordan. When Rome dismantled that monopoly and absorbed the kingdom, the political identity dissolved. When Christianity replaced the worship of Dushara and Al-Uzza, the religious identity shifted. When Arabic replaced Aramaic in writing, the linguistic surface changed. When Islam arrived in the 7th century, the faith of the population transformed almost completely within 3 generations. But underneath every one of those changes, the same families kept living in the same valleys. They herded the same flocks across the same wadis. They worked the same trade routes that now ran toward Damascus and Mecca instead of Petra and Gaza. They raised children in the same villages their ancestors had founded. The Nabataeans did not migrate. They did not die out. They did not vanish into the desert. They became Ghassanids. They became Byzantine Christians. They became early Muslims. They became the Bedouin tribes of the Hisma and the farmers of the Wadi Musa. They became, eventually, modern Jordanians, modern Palestinians, and the Bedouin communities of the Sinai and the Negev, in many cases living within walking distance of the tombs their ancestors had carved. The descendants had been pointing to this continuity for generations. The Bdoul tribe, who lived inside the carved caves of Petra itself until the Jordanian government relocated them in 1985, had long claimed direct descent from the people who built the city. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists treated those claims as folklore. The lost civilization template is a recurring feature of how Western archaeology was practiced from the 19th century through much of the 20th. A spectacular ruin is found in a remote landscape. The local population is dismissed as squatters, unrelated to the builders, biologically and culturally separate from the people who had created the monuments. A romantic mystery is constructed around the absence. The descendant communities are written out of their own history. Petra fit this template almost too perfectly. The Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt rediscovered the city for European audiences in 1812, disguising himself as a Muslim pilgrim to slip past the Bedouin who controlled access to the canyons. Western scholars and travelers flooded in over the following decades. The local Bedouin who lived in the carved caves and grazed their flocks among the tombs were depicted as occupants of someone else's ruin, not as the descendants of the people who had carved it. Photographs from the early 20th century show European archaeologists posing in front of the great facades, while Bedouin families stood at the edges of the frame, present but unrelated, scenery rather than subjects. The Greco-Roman sources reinforced the framing. Classical writers had treated the Nabataeans as exotic, foreign, a desert people apart from the civilizations that mattered to the Mediterranean world. Modern scholars inherited that lens and rarely questioned it. The Nabataeans entered the textbooks as a curiosity, a brief mention between the chapters on Hellenistic kingdoms and the rise of Rome. The political identity confusion compounded the problem. Because Nabataean referred to a kingdom and a trading network rather than to an ethnic group in the modern sense, when those institutions ended, scholars assumed the people had ended too. It would be like assuming the population of France had ceased to exist because the Bourbon monarchy had fallen. The genetic correction matters beyond Petra. It is part of a broader pattern emerging from ancient DNA studies across the world, at Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest, in the Andes, across the British Isles, among the steppe populations of Central Asia. The dramatic narratives of vanished peoples and lost civilizations that dominated 20th century archaeology are being quietly dismantled, one population study at a time. In case after case, the descendants turn out to have been there the whole time, telling the same story their ancestors had told, while academic frameworks looked past them. For the Nabataeans specifically, the correction restores something that should not have needed restoring. The Bedouin families who showed travelers around the tombs, the farmers of the Wadi Musa, whose families had farmed those terraces for centuries, the modern Jordanians whose grandparents pointed to Petra and called it the work of their ancestors. They were right the entire time. The genetic evidence has now caught up with what they had been saying for as long as anyone had been willing to ask them. A civilization was called lost, while its descendants lived in plain sight. A people was called vanished, while they herded the same flocks, farmed the same valleys, worked the same trade routes, and carried in their bodies the exact biological record of the ones who had carved Petra into the cliffs. The oral traditions told the story accurately for 15 centuries. The travelers and the archaeologists simply refused to listen. Ancient DNA did not rediscover the Nabataeans. It confirmed what had never actually been forgotten, except by the people who came later and decided the story needed an ending. The real mystery of Petra is not what happened to the people who built it. It is how long it took the rest of us to notice they never went anywhere at all. The Nabataeans are still there. They have been there the entire time.